This is MichMash, a weekly conversation where we try to unjumble an important and sometimes under-the-radar statewide story that affects you. I'm Cheyna Roth.
And coming to you from Michigan's beautiful capital, I'm Zach Gorchow.
Listeners, those sounds you hear are the sounds of public policy at work in Lansing, and you can see more if you watch MichMash on the WDET YouTube channel.
That's right, Cheyna. I've even got my cool press badge on. We're gearing up for a long night.
I am so sorry that you will be there for so long. Well, Zach, it appears the legislature has finally kicked into high gear in the waning days of total Democratic control.
Yeah, Cheyna, that's right. Remember the movie Everything, Everywhere, All at Once? Well, this week at the state capitol is kind of like that, except maybe almost everything, almost everywhere, and all at once might be more on point. So check this out. On Tuesday, and we're recording on Thursday evening right now, but on Tuesday, 316 bills saw a movement in the House and Senate combined. Now, we don't know if all of them will become law. In fact, it is safe to say they won't. But to put that in perspective, that is almost double the number of bills signed into law for the entire year so far.
Now, even at MichMash, where we like to get into the weeds, we can't list everything of note happening, but let's hit some of the highlights. Expanding unemployment benefits is nearing the governor's desk. Now, that's a biggie. A controversial paid family leave plan, seemingly dead, got a pulse this week with movement in the Senate. New regulations on firearms, allowing people to win more damages for medical malpractice. Zach, tell us some more.
Yes, it's like that old commercial. But wait, there's more. Police oversight measures, ending the ability for the Wayne County suburbs to opt out of the smart bus system, ending partisan gerrymandering of county boards of commissioners, some help for the Detroit Public Schools Community District, new economic development incentives, allowing local minimum wages. And yet, Cheyna, it's important to note, with the exception of the unemployment benefits expansion you spoke of earlier, it's unclear how many of these actually will get to the governor's desk, right?
That's right. I mean, set aside the fact that there are only so many hours in a day. By the time everyone hears this episode, there will only be 2 remaining session days left for the Michigan House and maybe 4 for the Senate. Oh, and we should mention, since last week's episode featured the debate over expanding FOIA to the governor's office and legislature, that legislation finally moved this week from a House committee to the House floor, meaning this concept is actually now closer to the governor's desk than ever before.
Indeed. Besides FOIA, there's road funding. That is the big subject behind me right now. If a deal on road funding can be worked out, questions about minimum wage and earned sick time, which are getting drawn into the morass here with roads, election law, and so much more that could see climactic votes in the next week.
Well, we're going to take a short break here, but stick around because when we come back, we're talking to Jane McCurry of Clean Fuels Michigan about some of the energy issues percolating during the lame duck session, like biofuels, carbon capture, and electric vehicles. We'll be right back.
Welcome back. I'm Zach Gorchow. Joining Cheyna and me now is Jane McCurry, Executive Director of Clean Fuels Michigan, a nonprofit trade organization dedicated to accelerating the transition to clean transportation in Michigan. Jane's also a member of the State Council on Future Mobility and Electrification. Jane, welcome to MichMash.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, Jane, what are you hoping to see the legislature pass before the end of the year on the issues important to your organization?
We are really excited to see bipartisan reception for some sustainable aviation fuel legislation. It's Senate Bill 447, was passed through the Energy and Environment Committee last week, and we're really hoping to see that move through the legislature, through the lame duck session. Essentially, the bill would create a tax credit for the production and use of sustainable aviation fuel within the state of Michigan, which is a real economic opportunity. Sustainable aviation fuel is a replacement for traditional jet fuel that's made from bio-based feedstocks. So that could be corn, soybeans, animal waste. And so it's a really wonderful replacement to a fossil fuel that Michigan has all of the pieces that we need to take advantage of this new opportunity. We have all of those feedstocks in abundance. We have a large airport that is interested in purchasing sustainable aviation fuel. And so we think it's a win-win for the economy and the environment.
So how would that tax credit work? Is it necessary for sustainable aviation fuel to be produced in Michigan, or would it just be extremely helpful?
The language in the bill currently says that the sustainable aviation fuel must be produced or blended within the state of Michigan. So the idea is that it would really be building up a new industry within the state and creating that production supply chain within Michigan.
So how do you think this legislature has done on clean energy? Of course, there was a huge package of legislation moved about a year ago, but I also sense some frustration with some of the more like traditional environmental groups that more hasn't been done. But you're sort of positioned in the world of clean energy industry. What are you thinking?
There has been some really substantial investments in clean mobility from this legislature. There's also been some key pieces of policy that have moved through in, again, a very bipartisan fashion. We have seen legislation to facilitate electric vehicle charging that allowed Michigan to harness federal National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure funds. And actually just today, the first charging station from that federal tranche of funds is open to the public in the Lansing area. We've seen legislation passed that would bring Michigan's vehicle weight restrictions into compliance with federal law, allowing electric trucks to have an extra 2,000 pounds on board to accommodate the weight of the battery in those trucks. And then we've also seen new programs be funded through the budget, including funding for Eagle to develop electric vehicle charging and refueling grant programs. And then 2 years ago, we saw a really amazing investment of $125 million in clean school buses. And the Michigan Department of Education is currently running that program to help Michigan school districts embrace electric and alternative fuel school buses. So there's certainly been a lot of activity that is worth celebrating. There's a lot of policies that are still on the table, though, frankly, and we're really excited to continue working with the governor's office and the legislature to move forward really important and impactful policies to continue to build on this momentum.
Now, the legislative session isn't over yet. Is there anything that you are especially pushing the legislature to get done in this few days left of its lame duck session?
Well, we know there are a lot of various priorities and opportunities in lame duck. The bill that we see the most opportunity for because of its recent movement is that sustainable aviation fuel bill. Certainly, there are other pieces of legislation that have been introduced that we would love to see action on, including Senate Bill 275 to implement a clean fuel standard in Michigan. We also see a lot of opportunity if there were to be a supplemental budget to continue investing in fleets. There is a proposal in this year's budget appropriations process to create what's called a My Clean Fleet program to help local governments adopt electric and alternative fuel vehicles in their refueling infrastructure. And so we would love to harness those opportunities in lame duck.
So you mentioned Senate Bill 275, the clean fuel standard legislation. As you know, that there are some environmental activists and groups that don't like that bill, that they have a problem with biofuels, that even though it's not kind of that traditional coal or oil type source of energy, that the animal waste that's involved is potentially detrimental to clean air, clean water. But I know that there's a lot of folks who say, no, this is actually a great source of energy and the environmental concerns are overstated. Can you speak on that?
Yeah, absolutely. In Clean Fuels Michigan, we really believe that a clean fuel standard is the big, bold policy that's available to us in Michigan to take dramatic action, to embrace clean mobility and to reduce the harmful pollution that comes from diesel and gasoline use within our state. The wonderful thing about a clean fuel standard is that it is inclusive. It's a market-based, technology-neutral policy that's based on science developed by the federal government through the Argonne National Lab. And so every fuel within the policy is assigned what's called a carbon intensity score. And that ranks that fuel based on a well-to-wheels analysis of the greenhouse gas emissions that come from that fuel. The policy creates a standard that says fuel providers providing a fuel with a carbon intensity above the standard generate deficits, and they must purchase credits from low carbon fuel providers to offset their deficit or to put low carbon fuel into the marketplace. And so it allows fuels to compete on their innovation, on their environmental benefits or detriments to our communities. And it's shown to be a really effective policy in the states that have implemented it. California, Oregon, Washington have programs that are working now. Canada and British Columbia both have programs that have shown to reduce carbon pollution dramatically and increase investment in low carbon transportation fuels within those jurisdictions. And so we truly do see this as a huge opportunity for Michigan. We've done modeling that shows that every single county in the state would see an air quality benefit, reducing particulate matter and nitrous oxides, those harmful health pollutants. Every single county in Michigan would see a benefit from implementing a clean fuel standard.
I wanted to move on to electric vehicles. EVs have not been producing the jobs that some had once promised, and it feels as though the tide might be turning skeptical when it comes to electric vehicles. How can the industry turn this around? What are they missing?
Well, there have been a lot of headlines recently that seem to indicate that electric vehicle demand is dwindling or that the industry isn't as strong as we had maybe projected it to be. And I don't know that those headlines are always necessarily truthful, to be honest. We saw a news article from indicating that Ford had their biggest month of sales ever in electric vehicles in October of this year. We have more than 70,000 electric vehicles registered on Michigan roads. And so we really do see that consumer demand is continuing to grow for these vehicles. Maybe not at the clip that we saw last year or 2 years ago, but demand is continuing to increase. And we know that that will create jobs in Michigan. Electrification is still a fairly new industry. It's getting its sea legs, if you will. We're starting to reach that turning point toward mass adoption. And so it's just continuing to work through the kinks and make sure that industry is moving along at the same pace that consumer demand is.
How concerned are you about sort of the partisanization of EVs? It seemed to be before it was, general support or at least agnostic views on it, but it became such a political football in the 2024 election, and the president-elect has said he doesn't necessarily dislike EVs, but he's not going to, buy whatever you want, gas-powered, EV, whatnot. And there seems to be this move against, at least among some Republicans, against big incentives to encourage EV sales. What do you make of that situation?
I think it's unfortunate that EVs became a political football because I really do believe that automotive innovation transcends political boundaries, especially in Michigan, where we have such a unique and steeped history in automotive legacy. Electrification allows vehicle choice. There is no EV mandate. Clean Fuels Michigan is a strong proponent of vehicle choice, and we want to make sure that consumers have access to all of the fuels, including electrification, that they may want that suits their needs and allows them to use domestic energy to get where they need to go and get goods delivered to them. So we still see a strong bipartisan opportunity here. We know that there are things about electrification that we can get both Democrats and Republicans to be excited about, including technology innovation and local energy sources.
Jane McCurry, thank you so much for joining us here today on MichMash.
Thank you.
We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're talking to one of the top education reporters in Michigan, Hannah Dellinger from Chalkbeat, about whether charter school regulations sought by Democratic legislators and registered by charter schools might pass the legislature this year. We'll be right back.
Welcome back to MichMash. Hannah Dellinger covers K-12 education and state education policy for Chalkbeat Detroit. Hannah, welcome to MichMash.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So, Hannah, Michigan is home to a lot of charter schools and was among the first in the nation, as you pointed out in your piece, to have laws allowing for and regulating charter schools. Can you walk us through what the current state of charter schools is in Michigan.
Charter schools have been around in Michigan for almost 30 years, and today they serve around 150,000 K through 12 students in Michigan, which is about 10% of all students in the state. And they are mostly in urban areas like Detroit. And here in Detroit, nearly half of all public school students go to charter schools. So the way that they operate, anyone can open a charter school, but they have to sign a contract with an authorizer, and that's usually a college or university. And sometimes it can be a local school district. And they have boards that oversee the school, and the board members are appointed by the authorizer. And most charters are managed by for-profit companies that are called educational management organizations. And so those companies are not subject to disclosing financial information publicly like other school districts are. And the companies can either provide all of the full service management, like basically run the entire school, or they can handle key functions like payroll or hiring or HR services.
So I think one of the things that often gets confused is that charter schools are public schools, but they're not traditional public schools. They're not the Detroit Public Schools Community District or the Birmingham Public Schools. They're on their own, managed by sometimes a management company, overseen by an authorizer. Both receive tax dollars that essentially for the same basic state grant per pupil. So with that as sort of a backdrop, what do the critics and supporters of charter schools say about charter schools 30 years into this? I guess it's more than an experiment now. They're definitely part of the scene.
Yeah. So critics of charter schools who want more financial transparency say that they are operating on public money, and these for-profit EMOs that are private companies are profiting off of taxpayer money, and there isn't the same level of financial transparency as other school districts because the EMOs can list their expenditures as one item, just saying, operating expenditure or purchase services, instead of listing line by line each item and how much they're spending on each thing like other districts do. And people who say that charter schools are doing a good job at educating students and who want more choice for parents say that there is enough transparency as it is because they have authorizers that are colleges and sometimes districts, and they have public boards, even though the boards are appointed and not elected by the public.
Now, Democrats have long pushed for public schools and public school funding, sort of the traditional public schools. And they've had a couple of years to make changes to laws to improve traditional public education in the state. What have they done so far?
Yeah, so Democrats, since they've had their trifecta of control of the state government in Michigan, a lot of the education policy priorities that they had going into that, they have achieved. They did create new funding for at-risk students that basically, instead of the existing formula that gave the same per pupil amount for at-risk students to every district, it takes into account the depth of poverty in a district and the concentration of poverty. So it gives higher percentages of funding to districts with more students living in poverty. They also passed legislation that changes literacy curriculum in the state to include the science of reading, which basically means including phonics with background knowledge in curriculum when teaching kids to learn to read. There's a number of other things that they've passed. They change the way that educators are graded on their performance. and change the school grading system and a number of other big items. So charter school transparency is really the last big remaining piece that they vowed to achieve with their control of the state government that they haven't yet gotten to become law.
So, Hannah, you know that there's been this sort of debate between Democrats and Republicans about charter schools for 30 years. Democrats have contended they undercut funding for traditional public schools, damaged traditional school districts. Charter school supporters, like you said earlier, said, like, hey, money should follow the students, not systems. And parents are taking advantage of this choice, voting with their feet by moving children to charters. The thing that surprises me is Democrats having control of state government for the first time since charter schools came into existence. They've basically left them alone. They are, we'll talk a little bit about, what bills are out there, but to date, there's been zero bills put on the governor's desk to restrict, limit, or do really anything to affect charter schools. What do you make of that?
Right. If you were to ask the Democratic lawmakers, perhaps they would say they had these other big education policy priorities that they wanted to get through that would help support students, especially coming out of the pandemic and with state assessment scores showing how far behind students are in both reading and writing and math. So they would probably say they had these bigger priorities they needed to address first. And even when you look at the bills that Democrats are pushing in their final days of state control now, all that they do is ask for more, demand more financial transparency for the for-profit companies that are running charter schools and to put restrictions on or not allowing them to sell or lease property to the schools that they run. These bills in no way put a cap on the number of charter schools or try to get rid of them. And during testimony for these bills, Democratic lawmakers were saying, we're not putting these schools down or the educators down. We want what's best for the students at these schools. We just want the same transparency that we expect at traditional public schools for these charters.
I think that's we should pause and just sort of point out how significant that is, because for years, Democrats would say charter schools are substandard. You're getting a worse education at a charter school. And it seems as though, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't know if they have, accepted that charter schools are, as high quality as a traditional public school, but they're not making the case anymore that there's a quality difference. Am I wrong there?
Right. At least in the hearing for these 9 bills that would create more transparency for charters, for the hearing that they had, they were not arguing about the efficacy of the charter schools or the performance of students at the schools. But if you do look at data on student performance compared charter schools versus traditional public schools, it's questionable whether the students at charter schools are performing better or even performing at the same rate as students at the traditional public schools. So, an argument could still be made that the charter schools aren't performing as well as traditional public schools, but that's legislatively, that's not really a discussion that's happening at this point.
You mentioned that package of bills affecting charter schools that could move during the lame duck session. Can you go into some detail about all of the bills in that package and specifically dig into what the supporters and the critics are saying about those bills?
Sure. The legislature really only has very limited days to get these bills to pass and to get signed into law. But basically, there's 9 bills, 2 House bills have already passed votes in the House, and they've been sent to the Senate for a vote in the full body. And those two bills would require charter schools to name their authorizers and the educational management organizations publicly online on student applications and on signage at campuses. And then they would also be required to list the average salaries of teachers publicly online. And the people who support these bills are saying that, to make the average salaries of teachers available helps teachers make a more informed decision about where they want to teach, if they want to go to a charter school or a public school district, a traditional public school district. And right now, that information is not publicly available. For the Senate bills, the main change that would happen is that the for-profit companies that run charter schools would not be able to sell or lease property to the charter schools that they run. A 2014 Detroit Free Press investigation found that a lot of the for-profit companies are doing just that, and they were leasing property at way higher than the market value and essentially getting profit from leasing or selling their own properties to themselves, like through these schools with public money. So Democrats want to end that practice. And they also want charter school authorizers to review property agreements, basically to make sure that this isn't happening and require them to notify the state if it is happening. And it would also make the for-profit companies that run the charter schools put all of their financial disclosures and audits online for the public to be able to review.
So we'll point out we're recording here on Tuesday, December 10th. There's 5 scheduled House session days remaining in the year, including the one that just started about 20 minutes ago. With that in mind, what do you think the odds are that any of these bills actually pass the legislature before they close up shop for the year, given how things have been going in Lansing?
Right. So what I've been hearing is that there isn't a lot of hope that these will make it through to the finish line by the end of the year, and that Democrats have other legislative priorities that are not related to education that they're more focused on at this time. But I will say the 2 bills that have already passed votes in the House, they probably are more likely to become law and get the votes in the Senate and make it through. But again, those are less substantial changes to the way that charter schools operate.
Hannah Dellinger with Chalkbeat Detroit, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.